Good afternoon, students of Classics 2000. It's great to be with you again. And today we're going to begin our discussion of Theseus. Now, we've seen heroes before in our discussions, and take, for example, the case of Heracles, or Hercules as we may know him through the Latin version of his name, where Hercules was a pan-Hellenic hero who belonged, as the name pan-Hellenic suggests, belonged or was important to all Greek people as a kind of heroic ideal. Theseus, then, is the particular hero the Athenians admired and, in a sense, worshipped. Heroes were sort of godlike characters, and that praying to them could bring about the fulfillment of desires. As we've seen, the Greeks propitiated their gods, so too there was a kind of a worship of the dead spirits of heroes. So we'll begin then our discussion now of Theseus, Athens' particular favorite heroic son. Let's see if we can get some images here to illustrate our discussion. And let's go forward. As we noted, Theseus is particularly associated with the city of Athens. You recognize this image, of course. There we see the remains, and in the center of our image, we see the remains of the temple of Athena, the Parthenon, named in honor of her perpetual virginity, and its remains stand impressively today atop the Acropolis at the center of Athens. To refresh our geography, Athens is located here in the southern part of the Greek mainland, the southeastern part, and of course it's served by its harbor, the Piraeus. We may have seen this ancient list of Athenian kings earlier in this course, or perhaps in another course we've studied together. But Castor of Rhodes, who was a Greek grammarian and practitioner of rhetoric, usually thought to have lived around the time of Cicero and Julius Caesar. And he's responsible then for creating this list of the reigns of Athens' ancient kings. Now, of course, he's making this list some 1,500 years after the case, so we're almost certain that it's largely mythical, but that's perfectly useful for us because, of course, this is a course on classical mythology. So Theseus, then, his reign, according to Castor of Rhodes, his reign going from the years 1234 to 1205 BC. And of course, Theseus would become then one of the most famous and most revered list of Athenian kings from Castor's list given here. In fact, it was even rumored or said that some 800 years after his reign, Theseus appeared in support of his fellow Athenians at the Battle of Marathon. Out of the fog of battle, it was said that Theseus himself appeared to aid the Athenian hoplites as they fought to repel the invading force of King Darius. Notice on this list perhaps some other kings whose names have come up in some earlier study. Notice this, the first king on Castor's list, ruling apparently some 3 centuries before Theseus. This was Cecrops. We may have spoken about him, or you certainly, I hope, have read about him. He was the king who, according to legend, had the form of a snake below the waist. And of course, that associates him in the Athenian mythology as being associated with the earth. And remember, the Athenians were particularly proud of their autochthony. That is the story that their earliest kings had emerged right out of the earth itself. And Cecrops and his snake body emphasizes that connection. When we spoke earlier about Athena and Poseidon, you'll remember that according to the Bibliotheca and Ovid's Metamorphoses, 2 of the ancient sources that record this encounter, as we see in a copy of the pedimental sculpture that would have adorned the Parthenon, Athena and Poseidon fought each other in a kind of duel, a kind of contest for the right to represent Athens as its chief deity. And this contest, in which Athena, of course, struck the ground with her spear, causing an olive tree to emerge, which was judged superior to Poseidon's gift of striking the earth with his trident to make a salty spring emerge. And this battle, memorialized by the Athenians on the Parthenon, and of course retold in the Bibliotheca and in Ovid's later work, this story then apparently took place during the reign of Cecrops. So when we remember discussing that myth earlier on in the chapters, or the sections rather, on Athena and Poseidon, that is the king and who was ruling Athens at the time of this critical judgment. We will have mentioned this fellow, of course, the fourth king on Castor of Rhodes' list of traditional Athenian kings. Again, several centuries before the time of Theseus, Erecthonius. You will recall the name? Erecthonius then was, according to myth, the product of this interaction. Remember earlier when we were discussing and reading about the Olympian gods, you remember Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare, who of course will be central to the religion of Athens. Athena was, according to legend, lured down to the workshop of Hephaestus. We see him here seated at his forge. And he had lured her to his forge with the offer of showing her some weapons that he had just recently crafted. But of course, he had designs upon her. And as we've seen in so many of the discussions of the powerful Greek male gods, they feel as though, and they act as though, they act in accordance with the views of the period, that this kind of sexual aggression on the part of gods, heroes, and perhaps men at large in Athenian society is condoned by the behavior of gods like Hephaestus. He attempts, in short, to rape her. She, of course, as the warrior goddess, is strong and is able to rebuff his unwanted advances. Nevertheless, as the story is told to us, and we remember it from both our discussions of Hephaestus and from Athena, the god of the forge, in one version at least, in a state of uncontrollable heightened sexual excitement, ejaculates upon her exposed thigh. We remember that she, in her horror, wipes off the divine fluid and throws it down upon the ground, where the divine semen of Hephaestus, combined with the flesh, the external flesh of Athena, a child is produced. And of course, this is, as we remember, the birth of Erecthonius, this important early king in the list of Castor of Rhodes, a list of kings. And you can see here on this red figure, Hutria, this water jug, you can see what might very well be this birth being shown here. From left to right, we think that this is Hera peering over the shoulder of Zeus. And clearly that's Zeus by the lightning bolts he holds in his hand and the beard, the crown. And I think it's fair to say that that's Hera peering over his shoulder. There's Zeus, of course, and here is Gaia, Mother Earth, the embodiment, the anthropomorphized version of Earth itself, producing then this child, oddly proportioned by the artist, of course, but that's certainly Erecthonius being produced in a kind of birthing blanket and handed to his mother, Athena, who has thus become mother of Erecthonius and thus plays a role in the divine lineage of Athens' kings. But notice how craftily, in many ways, the integrity of her body and the integrity of her virginity has been preserved by the non-penetrative act of fertilization. Of course, this was important for the mythographers if we followed the idea that Athena's virginity represented the safety and the intact nature of Athens itself. And next to Athena here, peering over her shoulder, is almost certainly Nike, her companion, and the goddess of victory, who's ready to sort of offer then this binding, which was often associated then with victory in contests. So it's an interesting list of kings, no doubt, isn't it? And we remember some of those early stories. But here, for our purposes now, we want to concentrate mostly on these two kings here from the 13th century, with King Aegeus, Theseus's father. I say father because it gets a little bit more complicated shortly. And then Theseus, whose reign apparently was around 1234 to 1205 BC, really just around the end of what we know to be the Mycenaean Bronze Age. And he's the king of Athens just in the moment before the legendary Trojan War that we discussed. So let's talk about Theseus then, into the strange circumstances of his birth. We'll note by now, I'm certain, that heroes, even some of the gods, follow their lives. They don't truly have lives, do they? But their stories follow often a kind of set pattern. And one of the things we notice with heroes is usually unusual circumstances surrounding their births. And we can see, perhaps, when we might think of the historical character Alexander the Great, how retroactive attempts, perhaps, to portray him as semi-divine focus upon things like unusual events surrounding his birth. And of course, many will be familiar with, say, stories in Christian, in the Christian religion, around the birth of a particularly important son, in this case, the Son of God, being attended by strange phenomena that seem to suggest a particularly important birth. So Theseus then, to begin the study of Theseus, let's look to his father, King Aegeus, king of Athens, in the 13th century. And of course, one of the sources we use for Theseus is Plutarch, the much, much, much later Greco-Roman biographer, who wrote series of biographies of real and mythical characters, pairing a Greek with a Roman, and writing their lives as kind of instructions in how people might want to live their own lives. He always pairs a Greek with a Roman, and Plutarch pairs Theseus with the Roman Romulus, founder of Rome itself. So Theseus has that importance to Athens as Romulus does to Rome, at least according to Plutarch. So in the 13th century, King Aegeus rules at Athens. But he travels from Athens to Delphi, shown on the previous map, specifically to consult with the Pythia. Let's take ourselves back, of course, to our discussions of Apollo. You remember the Pythian oracle, the Pythia, located at Delphi, sat upon her sacred tripod and was under the influence of the sacred vapors that apparently came up from cracks in the earth beneath her. She was able then to speak to and divine the will of the gods, and the priests would interpret what she would say under this trance-like condition, and then her sayings then would be interpreted by the priests and taken as though they were from Apollo and from the world of the divine itself. So King Aegeus traveled to Delphi, where he was given the rather unusual message that he was not to loosen the bulging mouth of the wineskin until he'd reached the height of Athens. And if he didn't follow this, he would die of grief. So he was told that he mustn't unloose the wineskin. Well, I guess it's fair to say he might have found this a bit ambiguous and wanted some clarification. So traveling back from Delphi before going to Athens, he detoured here, just across the bay here, the Gulf, just across the Saronic Gulf. He traveled to Troezen, where he would then meet with his friend, the king of Troezen, and he would ask his friend if he could possibly help him decipher this very unusual message from the Pythian oracle. He was welcomed, of course, by his friend Pythias. We know how the Greeks thought that xenia, this kind of mutual sense of hospitality, was so important. In fact, Zeus protected this cultural institution. So he traveled to Pythias and said, I've received this message about not loosening the bulging wineskin. Well, Pythias might have thought about the bulging wineskin, and perhaps he was drinking from a cup like this. And this is a view down into the tondo, the round decoration in the center of a kylix. And here the artist is humorously comparing a wineskin on which the satyr is seated. He's obviously making a phallic reference here. And Pythias understood. He believed then that the instruction was that he must not engage in sexual activity until he returned to Athens. Obviously, to Pythias's mind, a great child was to be born. And he interpreted then the oracle's message as meaning that King Aegeus would, when he next unloosened the wineskin, a euphemism for sexual activity, I think it's clear, that a great child would be born. So Pythias saw some advantage to himself, and he immediately then betrothed his daughter, Aethra, to King Aegeus. So upon hearing the words of the oracle, Pythias saw an opportunity for himself, and he married his daughter, Aethra, to King Aegeus. And on the same night as the mortal couple consummated their vows, on the same night, Poseidon also had intercourse with Aethra. And Aethra then was, according to the ancient belief of pregnancy and how it occurred, she was made pregnant simultaneously by the mortal and by the god Poseidon. So she would give birth then to a child who was fathered both by the mortal King Aegeus of Athens, but also simultaneously by Poseidon, the god of the sea. And we note that the birth, or at least the creation of Heracles had something similar about it. The idea of the double impregnation in the case of Heracles by Zeus, and here we have mortal and divine parentage of the same child. Oh, this is all getting a bit awkward to explain. Let's move on. So, King Aegeus then spent enough time in Troezen to impregnate Aethra. And then, having impregnated Aethra, as Pythias wanted, he returned to Athens. But before doing so, he left behind some symbols. He left behind his sandals, and he left behind his sword. So he left behind tokens of his connection to the unborn child. And he instructed the mother, and he instructed Aethra, that if she gave birth to a son, and if the son grew up to be strong enough to earn the connection to the king of Athens, he was to lift a great stone, because King Aegeus left his sandals and his sword under a great massive stone. And if the boy was old enough, strong enough, manly enough, and showed the kind of heroic qualities to lift the stone, to learn his identity, he was to take up his sandals and take up his sword, and then travel and meet his true father to claim his identity. Wow, that's fascinating, isn't it? Because it shares some resemblance then to modern mythology. And of course, those of you who might be familiar with a very small, quite successful movie franchise called Star Wars might understand that there were similar patterns in there, in which a young boy was reunited then with a father's sword as the first step on a quest to uncover his identity. And it's interesting that this pattern of myth endures in some of the most important storytelling of today. So he lifts the great stone, claims his sword and his sandals, and then sets off to meet his father. Now, the way in which he chooses to make this trip is very important in terms of Greek conceptions of heroism. He has to travel from Troezen to Attica. There are two routes. One is by sailing across the Saronic Gulf, relatively safe. The other would be to take the overland trip around the Saronic Gulf that would put him then in the way of 6 terrible obstacles. And he may sail easily across to Athens, or he may take the more difficult route around the Saronic Gulf, but that will cause him to face 6 terrible challenges. Now, of course, faced with this choice, he selects the more difficult passage. And of course, we've seen this in the past, and we've labeled it the choice of Heracles. And we mentioned Xenophon's work here as an example. You'll recall that Heracles had faced a similar choice in which he'd been visited by 2 allegorical figures, Vice and Virtue, who offered him an easy but obscure life that would gain him no fame, or a life of suffering and torment that would, of course, make him known to the ages in the future. Heracles chose the path of suffering because to the Greeks it was the path of suffering that led to glory. And here we see, of course, again, like Heracles, Theseus choosing the path of glory. So when we next meet, then we'll discuss the adventures that follow.